Hello, it's Patrick Haggerty doing episode 12 of Aunt Patty's Lavender Hour. We have a very special guest this evening. My son, Amilcar Navarro. Smile at the camera, baby. Amilcar isn't genetically connected to me, much to my chagrin. It'd be nice, but he's not. But he did fall into my arms when he was a month old, and I'll spare you all the details, but one thing led to another, and he's my baby. And he's done some really interesting stuff, so we're going to talk about it. I think I think one of the interesting things to get into about your childhood is to talk about a little bit about the diversity of it. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, it was definitely the definition of diversity beyond any standards that most liberals are probably get excited about. So it was a very strange bubble, you know. Yeah, it was weird, and the Pacific Northwest is a strange place because it's the new part of the country, and it's filled with immigrants from all over the world. You know, black people from the American South, Asian people who've been on the West Coast for multiple generations, or new immigrants. Pretty crazy class politics of an old working class who comes out of the timber industry or Boeing Industries. It was a very kind of gay childhood in terms of being not in the gay rights movement, but very like a radical queer movement, who were a lot of gay folks that were doing class politics, which was a strange grouping because there was a lot of gay folks, but not a lot of gay, what we think of as gay rights activists, you know? So that was, in many ways, maybe its own diverse uniqueness in and of itself. I think a lot of
It
people...
was a little subset.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people my age that had gay parents or grew up in some proximity to a queer community, that those groups were very focused on gay rights, or, more specific to like identity movement building, not gay folks who were revolutionary communists. So that's fairly unique, I think, But yeah, I don't think there's anything that compares to it for most Americans. The small world that I grew up in, it's was its own thing, and I don't know if it exists outside of that strange bubble of the people that found Seattle and turned it into a home.
Well, I was certainly part of the gay movement that was doing class politics.
Yeah,
And Fagala
yeah,
and Lois, Michael Hanrahan,
yeah,
your other dad, Rick.
yeah,
Um, we were all communists of sorts,
yeah.
or anarchists. And your mom.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything negative to say about your childhood?
No, I'm really grateful for my childhood and all the people around me. I think if there's anything negative, it's that when you grow up, or literally when you go to school, to the regular environment that everybody went to school in or grew up or had to function in, that the world, that bubble doesn't prepare you for life in America, So like that's not a knock at the way that I grew up, or but it's a hard transition, To you think that it's a good movie called, I think, Washington Heights or something, a Barry Levinson movie. He's got like a trilogy set in Baltimore, or I think Baltimore, of like multiple generations of Jewish American life. And there's a scene in his last movie where a Jewish kid says, he grows up and he realizes that there's no Jews in the world, but he thought everybody was Jewish when he was a kid. And I love that line because, one, I thought there was a lot of Jews in the world because I grew up around a lot of Jewish people, But then you realize that there's almost no Jews in the world. And it's kind of the same. Like if you grew up in the city, in this country, you think there's a lot of black people in this country. And then you make your first trip to the Midwest or something, you realize that there's no black people outside the cities, So you kind of, for me, I kind of felt that there was more of us out there, and then you realize that there's hardly any of us in every sense. You know, whether it's Jews, black folks, gays, and communists. Like there's none. Like you leave that small pocket of the planet, and it's just like, yeah, you're all alone. You know, it's like it's Christians and white men and straight folks, and it's just it's a strange one. You know.
The transition was daunting.
Yeah, you know, so I had expectations that, or I assumed that there was more pockets of radical people out there, and there's just not. You know, there's just very few. There's very, very few.
Anyway, you grew up
Grew up.
and you left home.
Mm-hmm.
You got on a plane and you flew to New York. Never to return to live.
Yeah.
That was the time when I bawled my eyes out.
I know, you told me.
Yeah, I got over it. Your leaving was a very difficult transition for
Yeah.
me. I used to laugh at my sisters when they felt blue when their kids grew up and left home. I would poke fun at them and make light of it. And then empty nest hit me. And it took me by surprise.
Yeah.
And it hit hard. I woke up bawling for months. It was ridiculous, actually. But I found out that it wasn't good to mock my sisters when their children left home. That's the lesson I learned out of it. So what did you do when you got to New York?
Started working in photography and video and kept going, you know. Eventually became a DP and an editor and a director, and yeah.
What's a DP?
Director of photography.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean you started telling other people what to do?
A little bit, yeah. As best as I could, yeah.
I'm sure you're great at it. And so what were a few of the highlights of your professional career?
You know, it's hard to say. I'm lucky. I got to New York before, while fashion was still kind of cool and exciting, and was interesting, and was like this little cult world of awesome, you know, ridiculous wealth and fun artists and people that you thought were, I assumed were kind of bohemian and you know, and quintessentially New York and cosmopolitan, and so that was fun, and I got to meet and work with some of the legends of photography. You know, my first assisting job was with David Bailey, the great English photographer, and it was funny because I accidentally started working with him before I knew who he was. So I picked up the phone and I prepared his equipment, and the English way of doing business is at a studio is that whoever picks up the phone and takes care of the equipment order stays with them on set. That's the English system.
Oh.
So they take one staff person, and that's their person that runs the building for them and handles equipment, and which I didn't understand. And we really liked each other, and it was great. And we were supposed to work again, but then he left town. But yeah, I got to work with some legends. You know, my first lighting job in New York when first summer I was there, I lit Calvin Klein for international TV. I traveled with Lady Gaga for a documentary that never came about, but it was great. I've got to meet my sports hero, Mike Tyson, twice.
Really?
And yeah, I don't get autographs from anybody, but I got 2 autographs from Mike Tyson because I love him so much. He's such a crazy dude and such a unique champion for my generation. He was just a tragic, epic mess of the 80s, you know, so he's quite special. To work with a list of massive Hollywood stars, and so yeah, I got to you know, live the dream and see the world.
Then you made a documentary of your own, right?
Yeah, I listened to a lot of jazz music, and so I met this generation that had come to New York from Cuba, that all went to their national art school system, and they were making great music, and we became friends, and we started doing social stuff together, and I realized that all these dancers and poets and musicians had gone to the same school and set out about making a documentary about the school they went to, and the documentary is the acronym of the school, LAENA, and it's done okay. It's done well at festivals, so that was my first film, and hopefully making another political film soon. It's well-timed about the invention of the white race, based on Theodore W. Allen's work and other people's work. So yeah, we're just beginning that, and I'm hoping that it will come together, you know, because it seems like this is a subject that people are very interested in all of a sudden, in the kind of current cultural moment. So hopefully that'll be the next film I can complete within the year, you know.
Wow, that'll be very exciting.
I hope
The
so.
invention of the white race.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure.
I think people don't understand
Yeah.
that the white race was invented.
Right. So it's different in different parts of the Americas, but the general idea is that the category legally and our common sense understanding of it comes into being out of the plantation economy to manage civil unrest and labor rebellions and rebellious bonded laborers. And at least in the United States, the Jamestown colony begins, I think, in 1607. First Africans are imported as bonded laborers, not as chattel slavery, in 1619. And the real, what we think of as white folks and black folks in permanent slavery doesn't really get set in place and in stone until probably around 1700. So you have about 80 years of strife and formation of these two groups and shared rebellions, and then, you know, the kind of permanent entitlement of the white settler group and former bonded laborers is kind of having a way out of escaping slavery based on the color of their skin, whereas eventually black bonded laborers became permanent full-time slaves. And the first person that's permanently enslaved is a man named John Punch, who runs away with two other he's a bonded laborer, so he has a set limited time on his contract, as well as the two other men that he ran away with, who were Englishmen. They weren't white. They weren't called white. In fact, the first substitution for white would have been Christian in legal documents. And we can assume that when they're talking about Christians, they're not talking about African laborers, African bonded servants. They're talking about Christian bonded servants, Anglos and Catholics, Englishmen and Catholics. And John Punch and his comrades are caught, and a very interesting thing happens at their trial, which is that John Punch his punishment is permanent servitude. He's a slave until death. His white comrades were given doubled their contracts, so they were locked into slavery, I believe, another 7 or so years, once completing their first term of slavery. So there is kind of there's questions about the court record as to why John Punch was categorized as a permanent life enslavement, and the English slaves were just doubled in doubled, you know, their contracts were doubled. But most people believe that this is the first step towards racial slavery and permanent enslavement. And I believe this is in the 1640s. So
It was in 1640?
yeah, so 20 years after-ish or so, the first Africans are imported as bonded laborers. And until then, under English common law, everybody, once you finished your term of slavery, you were granted a parcel of land, and eventually some were even granted muskets, and I think they were exempt from even paying taxes because they were expected to produce for the Virginia Company. So, you know, the categories of white and black in the Virginia, Jamestown colony, in Virginia and Carolinas, was a process of state making and race making over about 80 years. And philosophers such as John Locke weighed in on it in terms of their philosophy on slavery and the role of English slavers and civilizing Africans and all this sort of stuff. And eventually, by the time you get to the early 1700s, it's pretty much thick and set in stone that Africans are black, full-time bonded chattel,
So
and could be moved as like
the English Christian bonded servants and the African black bonded servants were co-equals. Is that right?
Definitely throughout at least the first probably 20 to 40 years, from 1619 onward, there wouldn't have been any legal difference. And, you know, former and bonded Africans became a couple became quite wealthy tobacco farmers and who owned slaves themselves. And I'm missing his name, but there's one quite important one. And interesting enough, when he dies, I believe in 1670 something, his property is appropriated by the Virginia Company. So that as well is another leap forward. But we're talking 1670.
Now we're talking about taking the black man's property.
The wealth, so that the wealth doesn't become transferable generational wealth either, even for free men who are Christians and, you know, what did the founding fathers, responsible men, you know, who tilled the soil and owned property and did the Christian thing, right? So even there, and in his case, as much as he escaped slavery and survived slavery and became a slave owner himself, even his property rights are kind of violated after his death, you know? But we're talking the 70s by that point.
It took them a while to work this out.
It took them a while to work it out, and they were running into all types of problems, which is they had contracts with the indigenous Indians of Virginia, and I think that the Potawans, and they had limits to how far they could extend the boundaries based on how much war they can handle with clearing the land with the Indians. They had to make contracts, peace deals at first, until they no longer needed to respect those treaties. But there would have been a problem of bonded laborers becoming free and inheriting more land, and this also comes to a head with Bacon's Rebellion, where both free men, white peasants, and African free peasants and bonded laborers all rose up together with Mr. Bacon, who was kind of a failed nobleman and kind of messes up his family wealth in England and comes to the United States and starts over, and he leads a rebellion. And one of their demands is to expand the colonial lands, to break the wall down and expand it so that they would have more land to dole out to the newly freed class, because there was no more land to cultivate within the territorial limits of Virginia that the English and the Indians had agreed on. So it's a strange one, because that war also puts in somewhat of an English or an American working class against indigenous rights to the land, right? So although it is a multiracial uprising, or a biracial uprising, right, of working English and African laborers and bonded servants, it put them at odds with the Native Americans, and kind of leads the way to kind of American working class betrayal internationally in some ways, lays a pattern that we'd see later of poor Americans not standing up against imperialism elsewhere, right? So that's kind of the beginning of the film, the first act of the film, and we follow that through to the 20th century with all the other manifestations and examples of making white people, the conversion of the Irish to being white.
That's an interesting piece right there.
So we follow a few centuries after that and kind of make the case that whiteness is a process in the making, and it's a multi-class coalition in which poor whites feel they're going to get something out of playing along with this white game versus everybody else, and in the end, it's something that the white working class gets very little for, It's as
surprise.
Amiri Barksdale put it, it's a protection racket that offers minimal economic benefits to those that sign on to it. So that's the film, Yeah.
And so you're carrying this idea of the invention of the white race and the history of slavery through the Civil War?
No, because I think once we get to the 17th century in the beginning, that the roles of white and black are pretty much static until you get to the end of the Civil War. And we pick up a little bit before the Civil War, once scientific racism comes into play in the mid-19th century. 1850s is when the first scientific racist books are written. And the era of science kind of plays into the idea of legal racism in the categories. It gives it scientific weight, that there really is differences between people. And, so we really kind of revisit these points in history where they reinforce common sense of white and black.
So the scientists went off in pursuit of justifying
the hierarchy established through the slave trade and colonialism in Asia and
Here are the
East.
scientific reasons why white people are better.
Why all of this hierarchy makes sense, right? Like, yeah, so scientists kind of played into it with pretty bad scientists, and unfortunately, even Darwin himself inspired quite a few reactionaries and race scientists, and and that's an interesting one because it's lived with us ever since. Scientific racism is still something we can't seem to shake. The new era of scientific racists are people, many of them that don't feel that they're racist, but they're obsessed with the IQ scores for justifying natural hierarchies and gender stuff for natural hierarchies. Reasons why men are really successful in business because they're aggressive and they're go-getters and they like this type of work, and women's wages in the same fields have fallen behind and they're not very represented because generally this is a very masculine job and men like it. So you see this kind of return of natural hierarchy and using science to justify it, both in gender inequality and people that are really obsessed with IQ scores amongst races. And it's that's taken an interesting change of course because historically in the West, white supremacy has been also quite anti-Jewish, but this new era of race, quote-unquote, race realists, they kind of fetishize East Asians and Ashkenazic Jews for their high IQ scores. And many of these people feel that, in that regard, Ashkenazic Jews are superior to Western Europeans. And Japanese are superior, and Chinese are superior in Western Europe because of how well they've done with westernizing and scoring quite high in the hard sciences on IQ scores. So they're really obsessed with it, but they're playing the same game. They're playing the same dangerous game. So in terms of between 1700 and the Civil War, we do turn to scientific racism as a critical element that's helped racism survive the modern era, and really pick up again after Civil War because you enter the era of lynching, which I think white terrorism is a very personal act of asserting whiteness, whereas a lot of lynching is definitely large-scale labor riots, large groups of white workers protecting white jobs, return of black soldiers from World War I demanding their right to eat here and move freely. So some of it isn't intimate personal violence, but I think a lot of it is, particularly the obsession with maintaining the color line and miscegenation, is very much a particular local white rage of how dare that Negro talk to that white woman. And, they burn a town down or they lynch one person, and the violence takes a bizarre sexual tone, kind of genital mutilation, and these were done with small groups of people. So it's a very bizarre, intimate, therapeutic violence of asserting white separation in rural America. And so I think, and lynching is interesting because it's also unique to North America. So the rest of the Americas where you have racial slavery, they kind of dealt with the post-slavery independence from Spain or Portugal in a different way. And they think that many of their leaders, their governors, the church leaders, their intellectual class in their universities, they knew that making free American countries would be complicated with the history of indigenous extermination and African racial slavery behind them. And they made certain choices to build a national identity and mythology that kind of did its best to incorporate people based on class. So you see a much more mixed poverty, you see a much more mixed ownership class. Very small representation of mestizos, Native Americans, mulattoes, and Black African descendant people within the upper class. But still, their idea of race is much more class-based. That if you become rich, you're white now. You have power. You can buy into power. You can buy politicians and this sort of thing. But there's only the myth of racial democracy in Caribbean countries and Latin America. But there's only one Brazil, right? And this is kind of the only country in the Americas where when somebody asks what are you, the white Americans will say I'm American, but Black Americans will generally say I'm Black. You don't feel included in the national ideal or mythology, right? So there's clearly Black Americans are a nation apart, and in particular, specifically, the idea of using violent terror to repress the black population is pretty unique to the United States. You don't see patterns of lynching in Brazil, and Cuba has one episode of racial violence regarding the Party of Color and a labor rebellion in the Orient, but and there was a period of pretty pretty disturbing anti-black racial violence in Cuba, but it's one episode, and it was kind of, assuming it was done by militias, not individual cells of Klansmen terrorizing individual neighbors, or kind of taking that act of repression into their own hands. So the Klan is really interesting, and it kind of begins as a mass movement to end Reconstruction and voter disenfranchisement, and then it kind of fractures very quickly in the first, I think, 10 or so years after its invention. And you kind of get a picture of the contemporary Klan, even though they were very large, I think more than 1 million members. They weren't centralized. They weren't building to be a mass party. So they kind of turned into very closed cells very quickly, even though they were still a mass party. And they had men in governor's office, and they had the ear of senators, and they controlled local judges and police. But the small cell terrorism and kind of random individual white rage that ends up with people being hung and mutilated and burned to death, that sort of thing, it's a very North American phenomenon in
I get it.
post-slavery racial history in the Americas.
It brings up a couple of questions. Can you assign a date or a decade to when English Christian Barnes people saw themselves as white and distinguished from not white?
It's for the English, it happens first. For Irish, it happens really almost 19th century. They came later. Catholic immigration was restricted, and it happens later. I'm assuming it happened sooner in Jamaica, where there was more Irish immigrants and bonded laborers who kind of acted as a white buffer. They would have needed them to become white faster, to be that middling stratum to manage slave rebellions and hold the system, the unstable plantation
Hurry
economy
up and become
in
white.
place. Yeah. And in the Caribbean and Latin America, they also recruited from former slaves and mixed people. So mulattoes kind of became the middling stratum to hold the plantation economy in place, and it offered a way out that you could become a bureaucrat or a businessman, a merchant. But I would say it's hard, because even in the slave, as late as 1741 in New York, the slave conspiracy of New York, when they interviewed the Irish cells, the Irish also said that they did it to kill white people. So as late as 1741, Irish, peasants, proletariats living in New York definitely would have not referred to themselves as being white. In fact, according to these court documents, they were committed to killing white folks. And in their mind, white wasn't necessarily a white race either. They were talking about Englishmen with money,
They were talking about killing the English.
They were talking about killing their bosses.
Well, with the last name Haggerty, I get it.
That's who they were talking about killing. So
uh-huh.
that's what it meant for them. And probably after the slave conspiracy of 1741, it was maybe the last time we'd see that fluid concept of color and what comes out of someone's mouth, what they're saying when they say a white person, And now we attach a whole pan-European thing to it. Anybody people came out of the European continent who are definitely not white, historically consider themselves white. I think the Italian immigrants, maybe as late as the early 20th century, I think there's all different types of categories. Even I know...
So they had to learn it later.
They learned it later, and I know even mixed African American people in Boston, New York, on the census were putting mulatto down into the 19th century. Pretty sure. And the numbers were quite high as the amount of people that would identify as mulatto. So the racial categories have constantly, in censuses in the United States, have gotten tighter,
You mean boiling down to
to white and black.
or your
White and exactly.
Mulatto doesn't count.
No, yeah, and the census is important because, my great-grandfather who came from Cuba, I'm pretty sure he's Chinese and African descendant. When he landed in Key West, he put down white as well, so there was some fluidity for him. and he's clearly not what anybody would consider a white man today, but he went as white in the United States in, I think, 1905 or 1895 when he came in. And definitely first Italian waves of immigrants and Eastern Europeans, they didn't put down white for probably one or two generations.
Wow.
There's a couple different categories for non-Anglo-Saxon defined immigrants when Eastern Europeans started coming to the States.
I have another question, but I have a comment first. I'm getting back to the subject matter of your documentary. It's going to be a 3-hour documentary.
I don't know. I think we'll do 2 hours, and maybe if people like it, maybe it'll turn into another serial project. Maybe we do. We keep this film as designed as it is, and if people like it, hopefully we can do more chapters. I think outside of that, we want to keep it specific to the invention of so-called white people, but I think you could do multiple documentaries on different groups, specific to the Irish, specific to Jews, specific.
It could go on and on.
Yeah, specific. The new phenomena now is the census in Latinos. This kind of turning Latinos into deciding, are you of African descent or are you a white Hispanic person? So they're still making white people. The census still functions the same way.
I'm relating the content of the film that you're making, the invention of the white race, with all of its class implications. It's very tied up in class.
Yeah.
And like when you were describing the early Virginia stuff that was going on, it was coming out gobbledygook because first you were doing race, and then you were doing class, and then you're doing race and class.
Sure.
What's striking me as interesting is your childhood. We were just talking about
Yeah.
it. And you grew up in a gay, straight, Jewish, white, black parentage and environment.
Mm-hmm.
That's who raised you.
Right.
Well, it's certainly relevant to it.
Yeah, this country doesn't make much sense to me, So these are all things that I've wanted to unravel, So it's close to my heart.
Yeah. Did you have a sense of yourself as a black person all along?
Yeah, but my sense of blackness is very different than popular common sense blackness. I grew up in an internationalist house, so to me blackness was connected to international struggle, and that basically everybody who wasn't rich or white was essentially black in my mind, and that's not really the way most black Americans feel, I don't think, so it's very different, to me blackness was tied up with those who work and those who profit and those who are revolutionary and those who are reactionary, more than the color of your skin, so blackness to me has never been something that is simply your objective reality, and that's the other, it's identity is two things. There's the way that people perceive you, right? That you have no choice over, and that you can't escape, which I think is one of the hardest things for wealthy black Americans that struggle with mistaken identity of being pulled over, that the police think that they're poor black folks up to something, and they're rich guys, and they want to be respected as rich white men, So I think in terms of, my blackness is not really shared by most Americans, It's a third world internationalist identity. It's a different thing,
Yes, I can see that.
And in many ways, that identity as being anything popular is almost a relic of the past. I think some of the last people that felt that way were a lot of South Africans, who also insisted that they were black during apartheid. That blackness is an objective political condition in relation to Western European powers, right? Like anybody on the bottom is essentially black. That's what it means, right? It's not a, it's a superficial description, but politically, anybody black is who's getting bombed, right? So it's like, that was kind of my idea of blackness. And it's really complicated. I've given a lot of thought to what in the United States for Anglo-Black Americans defines blackness, and probably like the institution that we have that is uniquely black is maybe the black church is the cornerstone. So it's very particular. Even things like my own family history and culture is like, I'm a jazz person, and that's my favorite American thing is jazz. I think it's the gift, but jazz is a creolized thing. It's not uniquely black. It's maybe African ideas played on European instruments with European rigor born in French music schools in New Orleans. So jazz is kind of, it's not distinctly black. It's distinctly American. It's distinctly New World, right? So I'm not sure if jazz qualifies as specifically black. It's specifically Creole. It's a New World thing. But I'd say maybe the cornerstone of a black America is the church. It's really those institutions that are truly isolated kind of spheres of black American, North American culture and ways of being and living.
That's a piece of your childhood that you missed.
In many ways, yeah. I'm an atheist person. I didn't grow up in the black church. So to me, the American blackness which isn't very much a part of most people's lives, is the black radical tradition, right? It's the rebellious slave to the freedom movement are kind of like my American icons.
The other question that I had about it was, it's my understanding in the history of European imperialism that the Spanish and the French and the Portuguese were the ones who colonized Latin America.
Yeah.
They didn't do this.
Not quite, not exactly.
And many of them married indigenous women.
Very much so. And African women.
And
fathered children, but respected the blood bonds between their children and their lovers.
Or they were out and out married.
Yes, and kept their mistress in the house and sent their children to Europe to be schooled and cultivated. There's that, forgetting his name, but the Haitian musician, so-called Black Mozart. He was the son of a slave, but his father took him back to France to be educated, where a gentleman should be educated, because that was his son. With his lover and his wife. They all went back to France. So, whereas Thomas Jefferson sold his children.
Whoa.
These are very, very different things.
Whoa.
But a lot of maybe historians think that this started because there wasn't enough European Christian immigration to Latin America, and so conquistadors had to have children and take wives wherever they could, and that group of people became the middling stratum. They kind of they played the whites. They became mulattoes of title and privilege and belonged to social clubs, or for example, Brazil in their fight to kick the French out, I believe, in today in what's Rio's, the slave masters offered their slaves freedom and land and title to fight.
Well, it's
and they became the gentlemen of Brazil too,
It's kind of an explanation of the undertones of this sexualizing of the issue. I mean, there's replete sexual undertones in the history of lynching. Mm-hmm. It's like, was the core of it.
Quite a bit of it, yeah, quite a bit of disturbing murders, acts of terrorism, where sex was a big part of their obsession.
And so, yes, because they all were pretending like they weren't having relations with black people.
Right.
But of course they were.
That's what's interesting in the beginning of the race codes in Virginia. A lot of the first laws were focused on anti-miscegenation, and that were breaking up mixed families between Africans and Irish. That seems to be the first attack that
Well, the
plantation.
English had a value of marrying English women and brought them in. That's certainly what happened in the Raj.
Yeah.
That was a value. You don't marry a native.
Right.
You marry a proper English lady.
Right. And then I think in Virginia, a lot of it was maybe more function than meanness and obsession. So I think the first race laws is English common law is you inherit the status and property of your father. You are your father's son. You're not your mother's son, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the colony, they changed it to you took the status of your mother. And some people think that was not so much to be mean, but was simply to produce more slaves.
In which colonies?
In Virginia. In Carolina.
Oh. Uh-huh.
So there's also a materialist element as to why you would want to ensure that more of these kids come out as property versus free people.
You mean an economic motive?
I think so, yeah, I think so.
Wow. Well, this is all very interesting. And you intend to make a documentary about it.
Yeah.
And you're into the initial stages of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where are you getting support?
I've been lucky to get support from Milk Studios, one of my old employers. They're lovely folks, and Rossi Mazdak has given me some money to get started, and once we get the website together and some proof of concept material, we're gonna take it to some producers and try and get it fully financed. So,
So that's the stage that you're at now.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be at the next stage in about several weeks.
Do you see this as an opportunity of a lifetime?
I think so. I mean, several months ago nobody would have cared about making this film, and now it's
really relevant.
now it's a
right?
part of the everyday conversation. So
the connection between race and class, is that what you mean?
not so much the connection with race and class, but I think the industry of anti-racism that's focused on white skin privilege and white fragility, I think there's a lot of people interested on when these things that are with us today took shape. I think the explanation that I'm giving, particularly the relationship between race making and class and a materialist history, is what is unique to my film and my perspective.
Yeah.
And it also offers, hopefully, a way out of it,
Well, that kind of comes from your socialist background.
Yeah.
Well, that's what your parents were,
Mm-hmm.
of one form or another. Rick, your mom,
Yeah.
me, we were all had a revolutionary consciousness.
Yep.
Certainly about class. I guess you picked it up.
Yeah.
Your film about Cuban arts and culture, didn't it pick up a couple of awards?
Yeah. We're hopefully we're official selection of Pan-African Film Festival, International Pan-African Film Festival of Cannes. Won the Nova Frontier Film Festival in Brooklyn, Best Documentary. We've been in a bunch of other festivals. Fine Arts Film Festival of Venice, California.
What happened in Cannes?
It hasn't happened yet. It was postponed due to COVID, so hopefully it'll happen in October. So we'll see. Fingers crossed.
So you're going to be in the Pan-African exhibition in Cannes?
Yes.
Whoa.
Yeah. It's
Can I touch you?
Yeah, I'm very, very excited about that. It's a big one. It's good.
Yeah. Well, those are nice honorifics. Did your Cuban film give you cred to propose doing what you're doing? Was that related, or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we haven't taken it to a bunch of producers yet, but I think so. Of course, yeah. It looks good. It's a good resume builder, Yeah.
Looks good on the resume.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm glad I did it because this film is infinitely more complicated. So it was a It was good practice.
Do you know what you're gonna title your current documentary? Does it have a title yet?
It does. It's called Aristocracy of Skin.
Aristocracy of Skin. Well, that certainly sums it up. Where'd you get that title?
You know, it's embarrassing. I pulled it from a David Roediger book, but I'm still searching backwards and forwards for the person that actually penned the term.
Oh.
So you have to give me a second on that one. I'm getting close to finding it again. It's really bad. I found it maybe several years ago, and I didn't take a note. You know, but
and now you have to read it.
I gotta find it again. Yeah, but it is.
You're almost obligated.
I'm close to. Yeah, no, out of respect for this person's writings, like but I got it from a book by David Roediger, and it's not a David Roediger term, but it's from another critic that he had.
The Aristocracy of Skin.
Yeah.
Does that have anything to do with racing class?
It's everything.
Well, I'm very excited for you.
Me too. Got a long way to go, but yeah, hopefully.
Well, hey, it's nice to just to be able to fantasize about it. And to think that I may have played a small role in the formulation of this film
I've missed the ferry, so
20 or 30 years ago.
yeah. So
It's very much an honor.
well, let me see when the next one comes. I'll call you.
Well, do you have anything else? Do you have anything else you want to say?
No.
I think we're about done. This concludes the 11th episode of Aunt Patty's Lavender Hour, where I'm talking to people who were influential to me in the history and development of lavender country and what happened to it. And that certainly includes you. This was a really juicy interview.
Different than the others.
Oh, yes.